Prime lenses are sharper than zooms, right? I mean, prime lenses offer faster apertures and so more blurry backgrounds than zoom lenses, right? I mean, professionals prefer prime lenses, right? Well, wrong. If you think that you need prime lenses to be a serious photographer, you're about 20 years behind the times. This video is going to explain why zoom lenses aren't just catching up to primes, they're beating them in almost every single way that matters. So if you want to take better landscape photos without carrying around 5 different lenses that you're never actually going to use, stay tuned. So my name is Will Barron and I'm an amateur photographer like you, and I don't know if you've noticed this, but there seems to be this big push by photography YouTubers to encourage people to buy and use prime lenses. So let's take a look at why they're doing this and why this is also kind of dumb. Now, first up, in a perfect world, prime lenses would be sharper than zoom lenses. Why? Well, because zoom lenses are typically much more complex than prime lenses, and they obviously have more moving parts inside them as well. And this complexity can have a negative impact on image sharpness. And you can think of it like this: a hypothetical, perfectly sharp lens would bring in light through a front element, it would focus it perfectly. In reality, obviously this doesn't happen because of things like spherical aberration. Spherical aberration is where the light rays coming into a lens are focused more tightly if they hit the edge of the lens rather than the middle of it. This is an exaggerated example, but if the light rays entering the lens are all over the place as they go through the other side of it, rather than being focused on a specific spot, then the resulting image is going to be soft. And you got to remember that you're compounding this spherical aberration over more lens elements across the more complex optical designs of zooms, and then you've got to compound all of this even further with other optical defects such as chromatic aberration. And when you pull all this together, you can see why, well, it's not unreasonable to assume that prime lenses should be way sharper than zooms. But the reality is, sharpness, or a lens's ability to resolve an image, well, it's a sliding scale. It's not binary. There's not sharp or unsharp. And for most amateur photographers, a high quality zoom lens on a modernish mirrorless body has more than enough resolving power to take images that are, again, more than sharp enough to print big and share on social media. Sure, right, in a perfect world, in perfect conditions, you might get a sharper image on a specific focal length with a prime lens, but is it going to be noticeable to anyone other than the photographer who took the picture, who likes to zoom in Lightroom to 200%? Well, no, probably not. So if lens sharpness isn't a knockout win for prime lenses, how about the fact that they are typically lighter than zoom lenses? Well, we all tend to have this idea in our heads that prime lenses are lighter than zoom lenses, and in reality, this is a dumb way of thinking about it. Because of course, right, a prime lens at the same f-stop as a zoom lens that covers that focal length, well, the prime lens is going to be lighter. But a bag full of prime lenses that cover the focal distances of that same zoom lens are going to be much heavier. And for someone who enjoys landscape photography like me, who needs a decent range of focal lengths to shoot in the mountain environments that I enjoy shooting in, a decent zoom lens like this Tamron 28-200, well, this is always going to be way lighter than the series of prime lenses that I would need to have in my bag to cover the same kind of focal lengths. Which then leads me on to my next point, which is, well, it's at the top of the list of terrible photography advice that I see given out on YouTube all of the time. This idea of zoom with your feet is one of the most idiotic pieces of advice that still gets thrown around the photography community. I've got 2 points on this. Number one, well, if I'm taking pictures literally on the side of a mountain, when one step backwards is almost certain death, then zooming with my feet is not really an option. This is the obvious rebuttal to this terrible advice, but we can go a little bit deeper than that. The second point on this is that walking forward to make your subject the same size as if you zoomed in and then changed focal lengths changes your composition entirely. So it's completely disingenuous to tell someone to just get a prime lens and then zoom with your feet, because you're going to end up with a completely different composition than if you stayed in the same spot and zoomed in to the scene in front of you. And because of this, zoom lenses will always give you more flexibility in how you compose your shot, because you got the option to zoom in if you like, or walk with your feet, or do a combination of both. That is why I always recommend to landscape photographers to use zoom lenses in 99.9% situations. But that 0.1 of situations where perhaps all you really care about are creamy, out of focus backgrounds, well, you need a prime lens for that, right? Well, maybe. Okay, so something that prime lenses do have over zoom lenses is faster apertures. Well, sometimes. Now, the 2 reasons why a photographer would want a faster aperture on their lens, or basically just a bigger hole for light to enter the front of their lens is to, number one, increase the amount of light hitting the sensor so they can take pictures in darker conditions. And number two, to decrease the depth of field to give their photos a beautiful, dreamy, portrait-style out of focus background. And genuinely, these are absolutely reasonable reasons to use a prime lens. But well, as brands like Sony keep bringing out more lenses like the frankly incredible f2 50 to 150mm lens, you gotta ask yourself the question, is there really a real world difference between f2 at 50mm on the zoom lens versus f1.8 at 50mm on the prime lens from a light gathering standpoint? Maybe, obviously it's immeasurable, but in real world, is there a difference? Well, it's certainly not night and day like it would have been on a much slower zoom lens from 20 years ago. And that's the kind of thing that most people have in their head as zoom lenses are slow, zoom lenses are heavy, zoom lenses are ugly and ineffective, right? We're thinking about zoom lenses from 20 years ago, not from zoom lenses today. Now, there is certainly a price difference, a size difference, and a weight difference between these two lenses, but from the perspective of a landscape photographer, I'll take the zoom lens every single time. So, are there any reasons why a landscape photographer like myself will consider a prime lens? Well, yeah, there is one reason and one reason only. So with all that said, where I've been bashing prime lenses for the entirety of this video, I do own one prime lens and it is the Viltrox 16mm f1.8. Now, why do I own this lens? Because I'm trying to get into astrophotography. And to be really clear here, I've only been doing photography for a couple of years. I've only been doing astrophotography for a few months, so make of this what you will. But in my experience, prime lenses like this Viltrox lens offer something that I've really yet to see being pulled off by a zoom lens, and that is reducing coma. Coma aberrations are where dots of light appear elongated rather than circular, and this typically happens towards the edges of your frame when you're taking an image. Coma is a type of spherical aberration, and it occurs when rays of light hit a lens off the optical axis and then pass through different circular zones. This leads to small circles of light to appear like they have a trail behind them, kind of like a comet if you're doing astrophotography. Now, obviously our brains instinctively know what stars look like, and so when the stars at the edge of your frame when you're doing astrophotography become kind of blurry and have lines coming from them, it all becomes really distracting to the viewer when they're otherwise looking at what may be very well a beautiful astrophotography shot. Now, there is one thing that you can do with any lens to reduce the amount of coma in a night sky image, and that is to reduce the aperture. But then you're reducing the light gathering capability of your lens at the time where you really need it most, when you're stood outside in the freezing cold, literally staring up into space. Now, this is just how it is. Prime lenses are best suited to have a small amount of coma versus more complex zoom lenses. So I found personally that stopping down this Viltrox f1.8 lens to around f.2 removes most of the aberration almost completely, whereas on my Sony 16-35 f4 lens, that still has coma at f4, which means this Viltrox at the same focal length is gathering twice as much light in the same period of time with the same or even less coma. And obviously that means that then I can use a lower ISO, I get less noise in my image, and potentially I get a better image when all is said and done. So this is the only prime lens that I use across the entirety of my landscape photography. But I want to know what you think about this war between prime lenses and zoom lenses. Do you have a preference of one or the other? Why not leave a comment below? Let me know. I'll be in the comments and I'll give you my thoughts and opinions and we can have a chat as well. And if you'd like to continue improving your photography knowledge, why not click the video that's on the screen right now?